You are sitting on a perfectly made bed in a room with walls made of frosted glass. There is no door handle on the inside. There is no window to the outside world. Just a low, constant hum of the ventilation system and the sterile, lingering smell of bleach. This is the final act of your life. The collapse did not happen all at once. It was not a sudden explosion of violence. It was a slow and quiet descent, measured in envelopes of cash and midnight phone calls. Let us count backward. Let us trace the exact steps of how a person who spent their entire life healing animals became a permanent prisoner to monsters. It began exactly 98 days ago. You were tying the final knot on a clean white bandage. The golden retriever was wagging his tail. You handed the leash back to the owner, an elderly woman who thanked you profusely and walked out into the pouring rain. You locked the front door of your veterinary clinic. You flipped the open sign to closed. You were deeply tired. You had spent 12 hours on your feet trimming claws, administering rabies vaccines, and treating minor infections. It was the quiet and predictable life of a small-town veterinarian. Then came the sound, a heavy and desperate pounding against the glass of your front door. You looked up. A man was standing there in the freezing rain. He was not holding a leash. He was holding another man. The second man was draped heavily over his shoulder. A dark red towel pressed hard against his abdomen. The towel was completely soaked through. Blood was dripping steadily onto the concrete, washing away in the heavy rain. You waved them away. You pointed down the street toward the city hospital blocks away. You signaled through the glass that you were just a vet and that you could not help them. The standing man did not argue. He simply reached into his dark coat, pulled out a heavy black pistol, and tapped the cold steel barrel against your glass door. You slowly turned the deadbolt. They stumbled inside, bringing the storm and the chaos in with them. Mud and water pooled on your pristine linoleum floor. Thick crimson blood formed a dark trail from the entrance all the way to your stainless steel examination table. The gunman kicked the door shut behind him. He looked at you and ordered you to fix his friend. You looked down at the wound. It was a jagged bullet hole, tearing violently through tissue and muscle. You told the gunman that you only fixed broken paws. You told him you did not have human medicine. You did not have the right surgical tools, and you did not have the training for this kind of trauma. The gunman looked at you with eyes that were entirely dead, devoid of any humanity. He said, "Fix him." The unspoken implication hung heavy in the damp air. Fix him, or die on this floor beside him. You walked to your medicine cabinet. Your hands were shaking violently. You reached for a glass vial of tranquilizer. It was a specialized compound formulated for horses. It was designed to drop a 1,000-pound animal into a deep sleep within 30 seconds. You stood there, looking at the clear liquid, doing complex and terrifying math in your head. You had to calculate the exact microdosage to sedate a grown man without instantly stopping his heart. You drew the fluid into a large syringe. You prayed to a god you had not spoken to in years. You injected the fluid directly into the bleeding man's arm. He let out a low groan. His eyes rolled back into his skull, and his body went completely limp against the cold metal table. He was under. You knew you had maybe 20 minutes before the horse tranquilizer wore off, and the sheer agony woke him up. You worked with brutal speed. You cleaned the torn flesh. You clamped the bleeding vessels. You grabbed a spool of heavy blue nylon thread. It was the exact same thick suture material you used to close wounds on Great Danes and German Shepherds. You stitched the human flesh together. It was going to leave a horrific and jagged scar. But as you tied the final knot and checked his pulse, you realized he was alive. The gunman had not spoken a single word during the entire grueling procedure. He had just stood motionless in the corner, watching your shaking hands. Now, he stepped forward. He reached into his leather jacket. He pulled out a thick paper envelope and tossed it casually onto the chest of the unconscious man. He looked into your eyes and told you to keep your mouth shut and buy yourself something nice. He hoisted his bleeding friend back over his shoulder and carried him out the back door, disappearing into the dark alley behind your clinic. You did not offer to help them. You just stood alone in the center of your clinic, staring blankly at the empty steel table. You picked up the envelope. You opened it with blood-stained fingers. You pulled out the stacks of crisp $100 bills, $5,000 in untraceable cash. Your mind raced with panic. You knew you should call the police immediately. You knew you should show the detectives the trail of blood on the floor and hand over the money. But then you thought about the final warning notices stacked high on your office desk. You thought about the clinic rent that was already 2 months past due. You thought about your daughter's college tuition fund that sat completely empty, and you thought about the gunman's cold eyes. The kind of eyes that never forget a face. The kind of problems that do not get solved by dialing for help. So you made your first real choice. You picked up a heavy mop, you systematically cleaned the blood off the white tiles, you threw the bloody rags into the medical incinerator, you walked to your back office and hid the envelope of cash deep inside a filing cabinet tucked away behind old tax returns. You turned off the clinic lights. You told yourself it was a one-time anomaly. You told yourself it would never happen again. 3 nights later, the illusion of safety shattered. It was exactly 2 in the morning. You were half asleep on your living room couch, the television casting a pale blue glow across the walls. Your personal phone rang. It was an unlisted number. You answered it slowly. A heavy, calm voice on the other end simply said, "The vet who works late, I heard you do good work." You stopped breathing. The voice continued, without emotion. "A friend of mine needs help. Same situation as before, double the pay." The silence in the room stretched and warped. You knew the right answer was to hang up immediately, but your eyes drifted toward the kitchen counter. Resting there in the dim light was the final notice for your daughter's university tuition, stamped with bright red ink. The quiet authority of your situation settled over you. You took a slow, deep breath.
Hello.
You gave the voice your address. The collapse was no longer an accident. It was now a routine. The second patient was a woman. She arrived, clutching her side, pale and shivering. You did not ask her name. You did not ask how the jagged tear across her ribcage happened. You simply cleaned the wound and closed it with 47 meticulous stitches in a neat and careful line. When you finished, her silent partner handed you another thick envelope. You did not even count the money until they were long gone into the night. $10,000. After that night, the back door of your clinic remained unlocked on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Word spread through the underground like a slow-acting virus. You never knew how, and you never asked, but the city's invisible hierarchy began to filter into your sterile exam room. First came the lowest ranks, the street-level runners and the desperate mules. A young man with a shattered kneecap limped in on a Tuesday. You set the broken bone using a heavy fiberglass splint originally designed for Bernese mountain dogs. You wrapped it tight and told him to stay off it for 6 weeks. A terrified woman with severe chemical burns on her palms appeared on a Thursday. She said she had grabbed something hot. You did not ask what kind of illicit laboratory she was working in. You simply coated her ruined skin in heavy burn salve and gave her strong antibiotics meant for livestock. They always paid in cash. They always left through the alleyway. They all knew better than to ask your real name. And you knew better than to look too closely at their faces. But as the weeks bled into months, the patients began to change. The desperate runners were replaced by the enforcers, the soldiers of the underworld. These were men with cold and dead eyes, built like concrete walls, carrying military-grade weaponry under their tailored coats. They came to you with deep stab wounds from territorial disputes and clean through and through bullet holes from targeted hits. You dug hollow point lead out of broad shoulders using veterinary forceps. You sealed slashed throats with the quiet efficiency of an assembly line worker. You were no longer just a doctor. You had become an essential mechanic for the city's organized violence. You learned the subtle differences between a warning shot and a kill shot just by looking at the entry wounds. You learned not to tremble when a man bleeding to death on your table casually racked the slide of his pistol just to pass the time. And here is the profound lie that allowed you to sleep at night. You convinced yourself that you were still doing good work. You told yourself that you were a neutral party, a healer offering mercy to those who could not step into the harsh light of a legitimate hospital. You used the dirty money to buy state-of-the-art surgical equipment, sharper scalpels, brighter overhead lights, high-grade anesthetics. You told your ex-wife that the clinic was finally turning a corner. She smiled, asked no questions, and congratulated you. You paid off your daughter's entire college tuition in one single, untraceable cash deposit. The filing cabinet in the back office could no longer hold the physical weight of your new wealth. You had to start hiding stacks of $100 bills behind the heavy water heater in the basement. You had made more money in 3 months than you had in the previous 2 decades of your honest life. You began to feel a dark and quiet pride. You felt capable. You felt indispensable. You felt like you had finally discovered the true purpose of your steady hands. That arrogance was your fatal mistake. It blinded you to the reality of the ecosystem you had entered. You thought you were a neutral observer, a ghost operating safely in the margins. But in the food chain of the underworld, there is no such thing as a neutral party. You are either a predator or you are an asset. It was a Thursday night. You had just finished a routine job at 2 in the morning. It was a simple dislocated shoulder on a heavy-set enforcer. You popped the joint back into the socket, wrapped it tight, handed him a bottle of animal painkillers, and collected your cash. You walked him to the back door, watched him vanish into the dark alley, and locked the heavy deadbolt behind him. You grabbed your car keys and walked out to the empty parking lot. The air was cold and dead. You did not notice the matte black van idling in the corner of the lot until it was far too late. The heavy side doors slid open with a metallic scrape. 2 men stepped out. They were massive, entirely silent, and moved with the terrifying precision of professionals who had done this 1,000 times before. You did not even have time to scream. One of them slammed a heavy canvas bag over your head. The world instantly went black. They shoved you violently into the back of the van. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing you in darkness. The tires screeched against the asphalt. You felt the cold metal floor vibrating against your face. You did not struggle. You simply lay there, the harsh reality of your situation finally settling over you like a suffocating blanket. The drive was long and silent. When the van finally stopped, you were dragged out by your collar. The air smelled different here. It smelled like industrial-grade antiseptic and pure oxygen. It smelled exactly like a high-end hospital. They pushed you down a long corridor. Your knees buckled, and you stumbled heavily into a cold metal chair. Someone stood behind you and cut the thick plastic zip ties, binding your wrists with a sharp blade. Your hands were suddenly free, but you did not dare to move. The rough canvas bag was ripped from your head. Blinding, surgical white light flooded your vision. You blinked rapidly, trying to adjust. You were sitting in a massive room, entirely enclosed by thick, reinforced glass walls. Beyond the glass, you saw a medical setup that cost more than your entire veterinary clinic combined. State-of-the-art cardiac monitors, automated ventilators, and rows of pristine surgical instruments. In the exact center of the room was an operating table. On that table lay a body. A tall, impeccably dressed man in a dark, tailored suit stood directly in front of you. He looked down at you with an expression of absolute indifference. He pointed a long, steady finger toward the glass. "You are the vet," he stated. It was not a question. He turned his gaze to the table. "That man needs your help." You looked past the suit, through the thick glass, at the unconscious person on the operating table. Your blood ran cold. You recognized him. Everyone in this corrupt city would recognize him. He was the apex predator, the man who owned the shipping ports, the man who owned the judges and the police force, the undisputed king of the underground empire, the crime lord, and he was dying. His pale skin was slick with sweat, and a dark pool of blood was expanding rapidly across the white sterile sheets beneath his torso. You shook your head violently. You told the man in the suit that you could not do this. You explained frantically that you fixed broken dogs, sick cats, and the occasional street thug who could not risk a public emergency room. You told him this was infinitely beyond your capabilities. The man in the suit did not blink. He stepped closer. His voice was terrifyingly calm. "You have kept dead men alive for the last 3 months," he said. "You did it with horse pills and fishing wire in a filthy room meant for poodles." He gestured to the dying king. "This is just one more mammal." You pleaded with him. You told him that the crime lord needed a real hospital, a board-certified trauma surgeon, someone who had completed a residency and knew exactly what they were doing. "Hospitals ask questions," the suit replied smoothly. "They file official reports. They call the authorities. We do not like questions." From the shadows of the room, a heavy guard stepped forward. You had not even noticed him standing there. He was just a silent piece of the background. But now he was front and center, and his massive hand rested casually on the grip of a tactical pistol holstered at his hip. "Mammals are mammals," the suit repeated. "Now, begin." You walked to the scrub station. Your hands moved on, pure, terrified instinct. You scrubbed your skin until it was raw. A woman dressed in dark blue surgical scrubs appeared silently beside you. You stepped through the heavy doors and into the glass operating theater. The crime lord lay motionless. You checked his vitals on the glowing monitors. The rapid, weak heartbeat and plunging blood pressure told a familiar story. You had seen this exact same horrific internal bleeding in dogs that had been crushed under the wheels of speeding cars. You looked up through the glass at the man in the suit. You nodded once. You told him you had to open the patient immediately. No more waiting. The woman in the scrubs handed you a scalpel. Your hand hovered over the crime lord's ruined stomach. For one agonizing second, you hesitated. This man was a monster. You had heard the whispered stories. You knew about the rival businesses he had burned to the ground, the innocent families he had destroyed, the people who had simply vanished into the ocean like they never existed. You held his life entirely in your hands. You could simply let him die right here on the table. You could make a tiny, intentional mistake. Call it an unavoidable surgical complication. Nobody in this room possessed the medical knowledge to prove otherwise. You could end his reign of terror right now. But then, you thought about your daughter. You thought about her bright smile, her warm laugh, and the way she hugged you tight when you picked her up on the weekends. You knew that if the man on the table died, you would never see her face again. You gripped the scalpel. You began to cut. The next 2 hours vanished into a blur of blood and adrenaline. You worked faster and more precisely than you ever had in your entire life. You finally found the primary source of the catastrophic bleeding. You clamped the torn artery with cold, mechanical precision. Your heavy blue nylon thread closed the massive wound. When you finally stepped back from the metal table, the glowing monitors showed a slow, steady rhythm. The crime lord's chest rose and fell with even breaths. You had saved the devil himself. The tall man in the suit nodded slowly. He handed you a massive, heavy black duffel bag. Inside was enough untraceable cash to disappear forever. They drove you back to the empty clinic parking lot. You sat alone in your car as the sun rose. You were incredibly rich, physically safe, and completely trapped. You were no longer a simple veterinarian. You were their doctor now,